After wishing everyone a Chodesh Tov, I'd like to focus today on Yalkut Biurim, page Ayin Beis, and Ayin Gimel. Now, I just want to point out, which is not going to be the main point of today, that when the Gemara establishes the restrictions for a korban chatos, it mentions two things: dono kores, v'shigagoso chatos. And when we learned the Gemara on Daf Tes, we had problems. It didn't make sense, to say dono kores and shigagoso chatos. I mean, that's two sides of the same coin. So I just want to point out, in passing at least, that the concept of shigagoso chatos is a reference to mitzvahs aseh. When we talk about dono kores, we talk about mitzvahs los aseh, violate a los aseh. And what kind of a los aseh will generate a chiyuv korban chatos? It's a lot aseh with a chiyuv kores, and that's amazing. However, when it gets to mitzvahs aseh, we need an exclusion that you don't have to bring a chatos if you violate a mitzvah aseh. Now you'll ask me, what are you talking about? You just finished telling me the los aseh has to have kores, so obviously an essay doesn't fit the bill. But the answer is that there are two mitzvahs aseh that generate a chiyuv korban and a chiyuv kores. And we would have said in the Havmin a chiyuv korban, but and certainly in Masechet a chiyuv kores. And those are Milah and Korban Pesach. And now the question is, let's say he violated one of those two mitzvahs aseh b'shogeg, would he have to bring a Korban Chatos? And that's why we derive from the Hekesh Avodah Zarah that it's got to be something which is Shigagoso Chatos, and that excludes these two mitzvahs aseh. Why? Because there is no Chatos in these two cases. So now we have mitzvahs los aseh, which are excluded if they don't generate a korban because they don't have a chiyuv kores. And then in mitzvahs aseh, which the violation of which would generate kores, we still exclude it from a korban, and that's called shigagoso chatos. And in the cases of these two essays, there's no shigagoso chatos, and that's what we want to derive from the equation to avodah zarah. It's always got to be something which is shigagoso chatos. The Ravid, in his Hasagas on the Rambam, in Hilchos Milah, uses our Sugya Yevamot as a proof against the Rambam. You know that the Ravid always disagrees with the Rambam, and this is not an exception to the rule. The Rambam writes that if a person doesn't circumcise, even after he became a gadol, he's not chayav kores until the day he dies. Why? Because every moment he could decide that he will circumcise himself. So the bittul essay is always hanging in the air. It's suspended in midair. Will he violate the essay, or will he not? The Kenish Vissen, we have to wait till the day of his death. So the Ravid says, if that be the case, then what was the Havamina that since violating Milah generates a chiyuv kores, therefore,
of course you could.
Might think that you have to bring a korban. What do you mean violating? How can he bring a korban? He's dead. He's only chayav kores after he dies. A very strong question and objection against the Rambam. Why do we need a limud to derive the conclusion that in violating Milah, you're not chayav a korban chatos? According to the Rambam, you never violated Milah until the day you die. At that point, it's very theoretical to talk about whether you should be bringing in chatos or not. So that was the Ravid's opinion, is that every moment that he deliberately pushes off Milah, he's chayav kores. And the Havamina would be that now that he does tshuva, and he circumcised himself, he should bring a korban chatas, and for that we need a limud deriving it from. Okay. Let me just see. I wrote myself a note as to where we should begin. Okay. Okay. There's an interesting paragraph here. I think the question is better than the answer, but it's not negaya, but I just pointed out because it brought a smile to my face. I was happy that somebody was bothered by the same question. You may recall that Levi said that you should add a 16th category to the 15 arayos of our Mishnah. And if you happen to remember, when Levi presented this to his Rebbe, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Rebbe said, Ein lo moach l'kodkoda. He has no brains in his head. I thought that was a pretty extreme kind of response, didn't you? So thank God I saw that somebody was bothered by this. And he says, this is the first major paragraph on page Ayin Gimel. He says, Kosa b'shut chavas yoyer, sheilu nishalti. Me'achar v'divrei chachamim b'nachas nishmoim. Chachamim should speak b'nachas, and it's based on a pasuk in Koheles. And yehi chvod chavercha chavim alecha kishalcha. How is Rebbe, and he says this happens, unfortunately, quite common in the Shas, they use such a word, such a phrase of zilzul, calling him ein lo moach b'kod kadam. And that's pretty heavy. So again, I think the kash is better than the answer, but I'll read to you the answer. Levi was a great scholar. Adam gadol muflag b'chach. Now, a person can make mistakes. We're all human. But when you get to a person as great as Levi, then what brought him to make a mistake? It must be that Levi was a little bit, how we say, laid back about that particular sugya. The machmas miut iyun ve'ashgach. Miut means he did not give it his full all. Al kain diber olav Rebbe kashos. Rebbe came down very hard on him. Lo chalila mikas, velo chalila migova libo gova rucho. He wasn't trying to lord it over Levi. I'm a great. That would be gaiva. And to attribute gaiva to Rebbe would be a very bad mistake. The Gemara at the end of Sota looks for various tanoim, each of which are paradigms in their lifetime of a certain particular midot respect. In the case of anava, of humility, the paradigm of humility is none other than Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So you can't tell me that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was full of himself, trying to lord it over Levi. But rather, this is, and here we quote the Rambam in Hilchos Talmud Torah, Im nikar l'rav ch'atalmidim misrashlim in Divrei Torah misrapi yadeir. If the Rebbe sees that the Talmidim are not pushing them, and lefichach lo evinum, they didn't put out the effort, that's why they didn't understand, is chayav lirgos alim. Could you imagine the public school system if they employ that? You'd be sued for verbal abuse. But in a halachic context, if you have a Rebbe and a Talmud with an ongoing relationship, in the framework of that relationship, chayav largos. It doesn't mean the Rebbe lost his cool. That he was, what's the phrase? Off the bat. He wasn't angry, right? What's it called? Off the rails. Off the rails. But rather, Rebbe was trying to encourage Levi to learn on a high level. And this, he says, is a fulfillment of a statement in the Gemara Ksubis, Zrok Mora B'Talmid. Okay, now we start what I wanted to learn with you today. The Gemara tries to prove, and this is Rebbe who's trying to justify Levi, the premise that our Mishnah should include even statements or rulings that are the subject of debate. Whereas Rebbe is going to reject this, and therefore reject Levi of Anusas Ovid, because the machlokes bepluta lo kamayri. But the Gemara now is defending Levi's approach to have Mishnah and all the Mishnahs and Yevamis, and bepluta kamayri, the Mishnah will make a statement that really reflects one particular opinion in a debate. And what is that? The fact that the Mishnah later on will exclude chalitza in the following two categories: Iser mitzvah, the Iser kedusha. Let's go over the two, right? This is the third time we're going over this, but you have to let it sink in. So Iser mitzvah, these are cases where, let's read the Gemara inside. On Daf Tes, second. Anyway, I didn't find it inside. You'll see it. It's on the bottom of that Tes Amud Aleph. It should say Iser Mitzvah. Do you find that? Anyway, that's a reference to what's called an Iser D'Rabbanan. Oh, I finally found it. Barei Iser Mitzvah. It's 5 lines up from the bottom of Tes, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And Iser Kedusha. The Pligi Rabbi Akiva Rabbanon Uketani. In the Mishnah later on, in Daf Chaf, the Mishnah says that these require chalitza, not yibum. And according to Rabbi Akiva, these would not require even chalitza. Why? So let's talk about Iser Kedusha. Iser Kedusha refers to a mamzeres, which is what's called chayve lavin. Now, in the case of chayve lavin, according to the Chachamim Shita against Rabbi Akiva, the Torah would require yibum, because we could override a lotas, it's not an erva, and there's a zikas yibum, and here the Rabbanan said we're not going to allow yibum, we'll only require chalitza. So if you have a mamzeres who falls for yibum, is chaletzes below misyabemes. According to Rabbi Akiva, she doesn't require chalitza. And why is that? Because Rabbi Akiva holds that chayve lavim ki chayve krisis. They have the same status as chayve krisis. And Rashi adds here Nesina. That's about 10 lines up before the end of the Amud. I'm not sure if Nesina is a lav. It all depends on what their status was on a Deraisa level. In any event, Rabbi Akiva holds that in these cases of chayve lavim, we'll give the example of mamzeres, there's no chalitza, no yibum and no chalitza. So we see clearly that the Mishnah goes into a machlok. It's by quoting the sheet of the Rabbanon, it's entering into this pluka between Rabbanon and Rabbi Akiva. And that's where Rebbe comes up with his thesis to differentiate between the first parak of Yevamis and the balance of Masechet. So first, he summarizes the conclusion meant to derive from this Gemara. L'das Rabbi Akiva, kol yevama basura be'isur lav, ptura min haTorah miyibum umichalitza v'chein pashut la l'Gemara. Gemara had no question about this, not here, and not later on Daf Chaf and another sugya Daf Ayin Tes. Okay. We're now up to B'shitas Rabbi Akiva. You have this? Ayin Gimel. Mm-hmm. Okay? So you're on the paragraph Minayin on the right side, on the fourth one. B'shitas Rabbi Akiva, Sheyevama Shenafla Lifnei Pitzua Daka Ukros Shivcha. He gives other examples of a lav. We gave the example based on Rashi of Mamzeres, Rashi it's Nesina. You could have a krus Shivcha Pitzua Daka. She'asur Allah b'isur lav. Now the Yevama, it falls in front of the Yavam, and it's an Isur lav. So it's interesting because he's quoting cases where the lav is a result of the Yavam. Rashi was quoting cases where the lav was a result of the Yavama and Hustas. Okay, it doesn't matter. Is Harehi Nifteres Michalitza V'yibum. So there's no need for Chalitza. And all that is Dorais. Ainu mishum shesover Rabbi Akiva shechayve lavim kechayve krisus. Chayve lavim, according to Rabbi Akiva, have the same status as chayve krisus. Inyan she'ein tosik b'ayim kedushin. So if a man would marry a mamzeres, or let's say he's a mamzer and she's a basis, or he's a petzua daka, etc., the kedushin are not valid. Why? Because Rabbi Akiva upgrades the status of Chayve Lavim, equating them with Chayve Krisus. But Chen Linyan of Vlad, if they went ahead and had a relationship, in the case, see, that's why he leaves out Mamzeres, because everybody agrees that the Vlad of a Mamzeres is a Mamzer, a Mamzeres. But in the case of, let's say, a Petzua Daka or Krushivcha, any other of the Chayve Lavim, the Vlad, the child that's born of such a relationship, according to Rabbi Akiva, since he equates it with Chayve Krisus, is Mamzer. That is a summary of the Gemara itself. Okay, then? And now we get to the problems. We did something. All right. Pikshu hatosis. Hello, sof, Abraham Kurtz, a lav bilva. I can agree with you that Ein Kiddushin Tos, according to Rabbi Akiva and Chayve Lavin. I can agree with you that the relationship between he and she, in the case of Chayve Lavin, is that of an Erva. I can agree with you that the Vlad of such relationship is a mamzer, but I still think that this should be evil, even according to Rabbi Akiva. Why? Yavo essay shel yibum v'yidcha lo taseh shebahem. Even if I agree with you that ein essay docha lotas yesh bo kares, but yet an essay could be docha a losas she'ein bo kares. And of that principle, there's no doubt, there's no question. You can give me all the classifications of Rabbi Akiva l'chumra of Chayve Lavim, but that doesn't undermine the principle of essay docha losas. And even if in Chayve Krisus the essay does not have the power to override the losas, let's say for example achos ishto, but in the case of a krut shivcha and the like, the essay should be docha the losas. Brilliant question at Tosfos. It's not only brilliant, it's just fundamental. I mean, it just proves to us that we're missing a whole chunk of this sugya that we completely skipped over, because we're not going to undermine the principle of essay dochalosas. And the Gemara assumes that this halacha, that chayve lavim equal, according to Rabbi Kiva, equal chayve krisus, that halacha kicks in the case of yibum. There's no yibum. Just like there's no yibum according to everyone in the case of chayve krisus, there's no yibum according to Rabbi Kiva in the case of chayve lavim. Because chayve lavim have all the trimmings and all the chumras of chayve krisus according to Rabbi Kiva. A, B, and C. Number one, we said that there's a status of an erva. Number two, Ein Kedushin Tosin. Number three, the Vlad is a mount. But that doesn't undermine the principle of Esei Dochalosis. And Bishlema in a Chayve Kusa situation, you could say the essay of Yibum does not have the power over our Lotsa Shishpokaris, but now we're talking about a law. So why not activate the principle of Esei Dochalosis? I'm thinking out loud now, just the thought occurred to me that even if you're going to tell me that we can advocate in favor of chalitza, but the Gemara is assuming that according to Rabbi Kiva, you don't even need chalitza. Meaning, in the framework of Esei Dochalosas, I can always say, well, Efshel Kaim Shneiim. You don't have to violate the law, which is chamor according to Rabbi Kiva, in order to achieve the essay. But because you have another option of what? Of chalitza, but we're assuming according to Rabbi Kiva, she doesn't even need chalitza. Of her Ramban Litaris. This Ramban is going to prove to me, at least, hopefully to you as well, that Lumdus was not created by Reb Chaim Briskin. It predates Reb Chaim. It goes back to the Ramban. Achar shegilsa Torah barayos shepaka zikason. Right? Let's assume that at least as a havamina, essay dochalosa sheish bokares. If you remember, we might have derived that from Shotli Basheli, with Kibbud Av that overrides the Shabbos, and Shabbos sheish bokares. Let's assume there was such a havamina that an essay could be dochalosa sheish bokares. Maskada, right? The Torah says litzrar, and we derive the conclusion that there's no yibum in the case of an erva. So we see that our logic of Esei Dochalosas was suspended by the Torah itself in the case of an erva vis-a-vis the mitzvah of yibum. And an erva does not fall for yibum. And the question is, who's included in erva? Well, the Chacham say only if even Karis is Karis and above is included under Arayas. And Rabbi Akiva says even Karis and below, as long as you have a lotas, then you're already in the section of Arayas, in the parish of Arayas. And furthermore, as we said before, according to Rabbi Akiva, so we go back to the Yalfusa that there's no yibum in chayve krisus, and we're going to say, why is there no yibum in chayve krisus? Because there's no tfisas kedushin, which leads us back to a principle that we discussed in the past, that the mitzvah of yibum requires creating ishus, but ain't tfisas kedushin. Once we have that breakthrough, forget about esei dochalosis. There is no nefil yibum. There's no zikas yibum. Why? Because we learned from Arayos that the Torah is suspending the principle of Esei Dochalosaseh, and there is no zikas yibum in the case of Arayos. And why? Again, the logic is because ain't both tfisas kedushin. Well, if that be the case, it fits like a glove, according to Rabbi Akiva, for chayvei lavin. Ol shalotosim bo kedushin, if kas zikasim. And if there's no zika, then there's no yibum and there's no chalitz. So forget about Esei Dochalosis. We're not even going to go down that path. There is no zika in this case. Why? Because if there's no tfisas kedusha, there's no zika. If there's no zika, then there's no yibum, there's no chalitza, there's nothing to talk about. There's no tfisas kedusha. That's it. And again, we only know this after we derive the conclusion that arayos of the level of the ilk of chayve krisus are excluded from zikas yibum, because there's no tfisas kedusha, there's no yibum, then applying that principle to chayve lavim according to Rabbi Akiva, there's no tfisas kedusha and chayve lavim, hence there's no yibum, there's no chalitza, there's no zika, there's nothing to talk about. And according to Ramban, that's the logic that underlies three different sugyas. One here on Daf Tes, another fast forward to Daf Chaf, and a third one at the end of Masechet Yevamot. What Daf do we say was Ayin Tes? Vadayin Kosh. Ramban is still bothered. And we thought the kasha was gewaldig and the teretz was gewaldig. Everything was glatt, but it's not so. Back to Ramban, Eichon Shamanu Kain Lehedja, B'divrei Rabbi Akiva, Ad Kidei Lahakshos Mizeh B'Pshitus. If Rabbi Akiva wants to teach us that since there's no tfisas kedusha and chayve lavim, therefore ipso facto there's no mitzvah of yibum, Rabbi Akiva should have said that. How could Rabbi Akiva leave out this critical piece of information that we have to know? And that is that any shem erva, by definition, is included in the alfusa of achos ishto to the exclusion of zikas yibum. Lafkia zikas yibum. I mean, that's a critical piece of information. And maybe, I don't know if this is borderline in philosophy, but maybe we could say that if the purpose of yibum and the Torah's command of yibum is lahakim zer liyachiv, maybe the Torah would be more makil in the case of chayve lavin than in the case of chayve krisus. Maybe Rabbi Akiva is not denying that these are two different levels. We have chayve misa, we have chayve krisus, now we have chayve lavin, p'tzua daka, and all the like. The Torah is not so machmir. Again, we have a lot of chumras according to Rabbi Akiva, but it's still only chayve lavin. There's no ktiv kares. Maybe for the better good or the ends will justify the means of lahakim shem liachiv, maybe the Torah is excluding chayve krisus and not chayve lavin. But in any event, the bottom line is, argues Ramban, somewhere in the lexicon of Rabbi Akiva's rulings, it should have said that since there's no tfisas kedushin and chayve lavin, therefore there's no zika liyibum. And we're going to extend the original limud, the alfusa, from achos ishto in chayve krisus and apply to chayve lavin as far as yibum is concerned. Yeah, we know that chayve lavin, according to Rabbi Akiva, have the same, how shall I say, the same halachic manifestations. Namely, they completely block tfisas kedushin, and there's a shame error. We know that according to Rabbi Akiva. But to what extent does that impact on yibum? And after all, it was a havamina that yibum would apply even in chayve krisus. Now the Torah says no, but do we go a step further and say, well, kol didomila, it's krisus for kol didomila. Ma krisus ain't no tfisas kedushin. Af ani, like Hashem of krisus, af ani avi chayve lavin according to Rabbi Akiva because ain't no tfisas kedushin. I mean, we should have had that in Rabbi Akiva's presentation. How can he leave that out? With Tiret Rajba, apparently the Rajba was so bothered by this that he had to come up with a technical answer to this question. The Chachmei Agmara Yibekiyim v'divrei Rabbi Akiva v'yadu shekeni shitasa. The Ramban might be yelling and screaming, well, why didn't Rabbi Akiva say this? He never explicitly mentioned this, but the Gemara were Bekiyim, they were experts in the words of Rabbi Akiva. And they knew that this was Rabbi Akiva's shita, that Rabbi Akiva had expressed, had professed this shita in the past. even though it's not written explicitly. I mean, this touches on, the whole concept of Misora and that which is written and Eis Lasos Hashem, we're not allowed to write the Torah down. But there's certain oral tradition. So we had an oral tradition, says the Rashba, the effect that Rabbi Akiva held that there's no Zikas even at all in Chayvei Lav. So don't be bothered by the fact that we don't see or we don't hear from Rabbi Akiva that statement. Haritva Hosif, Shemikevan Sheikar Din Erva, Bitzaros Biyibu, Nidrash Mi, Bishalach Osalo Sikat Bitzor, who adin l'chol mishi yeshno b'bal tikach. Klomer she'eno bas l'kuth. Rabbi Akiva afchai v'lam b'chlal. When the Torah says lo tikach, it means that eno bas l'kuth. The Torah is not just telling you that there's no ma'aseh yibum, that there's no actual realization of the intimacy of Yibum, but the Torah is going a step further and saying lo tikach. You know why there's no Yibum? Because it's not a lo tikach. It's not a bas l'kufin. What is a woman who's not a bas l'kufin? Well, point to Chachamim, it means she's an Erev of Chayvei Krisa. Point to Rabbi Akiva, it means she's an Erev of Chayvei Lavan. So the Ritva, in effect, is again so much bothered by this question that he comes up with a new drasha, which, to the best of my knowledge, doesn't appear anywhere. And that is lo tikach means lav bas l'kuth. And the Torah is excluding yibum in a case of lav bas l'kuth. And by the way, we're going down generations. Of course, the Ramban is the first generation, and the Rashba is the next generation, the Ritva is the next generation. The Ramban threw out this problem, and then for generations to come, they're going to deal with this question. Okay. Now we get to something really interesting. I mean, everything is interesting. The Gemara has a principle called kol she'eno ola liyibum, eno ola lechalitza. And the Gemara assumes that that applies to chayvei kritzos. And why? Because ein tofsin kedusha. So the eno ola liyibum, and therefore eno ola chalitza, means eno ola liyibum because there's no tfisis kedushin. And once we say eno ola liyibum, we say eno ola chalitza. That's the Gemara's principle. It's an all or nothing proposition. Either there is a zika, and therefore there's both yibum and chalitza, or there is no zika. And if there's no zika as far as yibum is concerned, then ipso facto, there's no zika to be mechayev chalitza as well. And all this is based on the fact that ain't tfisas kedushin. If ain't tfisas kedushin, then the entire entity of yibum is out of the ballpark. It's out of question. I mean, the Torah can't say, well, marry this woman, and in the same, the other side of its mouth, the Torah says, well, the marriage is not valid. If the Torah is saying you can't create a valid issues relationship, a marriage because ain't tfisas kedushin, then the Torah can't turn around and say, go ahead and marry this. And if that be the case, it must apply to chalitza as well. Because chalitza means, well, you have another option. You didn't take up the option of the Torah, the opportunity for the mitzvah of yibum. Well, that doesn't apply over there. There's no tfisas kedushin. And therefore the Torah did not command you in the mitzvah of yibum with a woman that there's no tfisas kedushin. And if so, mistaber af lefocham michalitza. When we say kol she'ena ola liyibum, ena ola chalitza, she'etzem ma she'ena ola liyibum hu agorem lo lipotem michalitza. The Torah is teaching us what's the root that generates both yibum and chalitza. It's a common root. And therefore, if I know that under certain circumstances, there is no generation of a mitzvah of yibum, then you don't have that same root in order to generate a chiyuv chalitza. So again, it's not A causes B, but rather A and B emanate from the same source, from the same root. And all I have to do is prove to you that there's no A, then ipso facto, it means the root is not there, it's absent, and there's no B. So in the case of Eina Ola Liyibum, Eina Ola Chalitza, it's not that because she's Eina Ola Liyibum, if there's a new halacha, a new principle, she's Eina Ola Chalitza. No, that's not what we're saying. Theoretically, you could have Chalitza without Yibum. But Eina Ola Liyibum, Eina Ola Chalitza is because if there's one root reason, one cause for the exclusion of Yibum, that cause will also exclude Chalitza. And what is the cause in the case of Erev that excludes Yibum? It's Tfisas Kedushin. That cause will likewise remove Chalitza. Umashena Ola Liyibum, that Ma, which is, we'll call it X, Ma means the Tfisas Kedushin, who are gorim lo lipotem b'chalitza. It's a Torah b'kaf. Kol shein tfisas kedushin, af zika lechalitza. Eno. He uses fancy Hebrew language, eno tofesis, but it means there cannot be a zika to chalitza if there's no chalitza to yibum. And we have derived that if ein tfisas kedushin, and therefore there's no yibum, it means therefore there's no zika. And if there's no zika, there's no chalitza. So we have A causing B causing C. It's like a chain of logical propositions. The first proposition is that in the case of Haive Krisus, there's no Tfisas Kedushin. Second proposition is if there's no Tfisas Kedushin, then there's no Zika Sibum. And therefore we formulate the third proposition that emanates from the same source. If there's no Tfisas Kedushin, there's no Zika, hence there's no Chalitza. Just like the Torah says, you cannot create Yibum, you cannot fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum in a case of a woman where there's no Tfisas Kedushin. And the reason for that is the purpose, the goal of Yibum is to create Ishus, to create Kedushin. So too, the same thing applies for Chalitza, that there's got to be a Zika with an opportunity or potential of Tfisas Kedushin, and the lack thereof, there's no Chalitza, there's no Zika. And basically, this really touches on the principle that we've discussed till it's coming out of our ears, that Zika itself is Ishus. And if the Torah is telling between him and her, they cannot be Ishus, there's no Tfisas Kedushin, then there's no Zika. And once again, we add our final conclusion, if there's no Zika, hence there's no Chalitza as well. And in parentheses, writes me, Otasi ba she'enlo be'erva olo liyibum, machmas she'ena nitfas ba shum inyan shal ishus, me'otasi ba atzma af ein nitfeset ba zika lechalitza. And this is what Ramban really means when he says that the Gemara knew Pashut, that according to Rabbi Akiva and Chayve Lavin, there's no Yibum and there's no Chalitza. If he said Pshita, Shal Rabbi Akiva, Sovish Chayve Lavin, Kechayve Krisus, the Af Bohen Ein Tfisas Kedushin, I Efshar Shetitofes Bohen Af Zika. Zika and Tfisas Kedushin are mutually exclusive because Zika itself is a form of Ishus. And if there's no Tfisas Ishus, then there cannot be Zika. And that excludes not only Yibum, but Chalitza as well. And perhaps we can fit this all into the Ritva, who came up with this new drasha that, what does it say in the pasuk there? Isha el achosa lo sikach litzor. Lo sikach means because she's not a bar lekicha, not a bar lekicha. And that means that you can't have yibum and zikas yibum if there's no bar lekicha, if there's no ishas, him and her. We have a problem. This kasha I love. The Gemara says that we need a pasuk litzra to exclude erev from yibum because the halamin would have been esei docha losas, and the maskana is that we don't apply esei docha losa because there's a chiyuv karetz, and an esei cannot override a lav sheish bo karetz. The implication is that if it was a lav she'ein bo karetz, meaning a lav like krus shibka, then we would apply the principle of esei docha losas. And I don't understand, according to Rabbi Akiva, why in Chayvei Lav, like Kushifta, is there no Yibum? Adayin tzorch iyun b'sugis haGemara shetoles haptur ervam miyibum the essay docholosas sheish bo karetz. Would there be Yibum in the case of an erva like achos ishto or not? That depends. Do we apply essay docholosas sheish bo karetz or do we not apply essay? If we would apply essay docholosas to override achos ishto. It's a misyabemes. Hello, his chadish bedin kol shein ol libum ein ol chalitz shekol shelo tovsu ba kedusha ein tovsu ba zika. What was the hamamina to apply the principle of essay docholosas to a case of a chiyuv kares, and how much more so to a case of a chiyuv lav, according to Rabbi Akiva? If our premise is that zikas yibum is a kind of an ishus, and there's no tfisas kedushin, why is the Gemara analyzing this sugya from the perspective of the principle of essay docholosas? And we have a problem because it's a losa sheish bo kares. The essay doesn't have the power to override a losa sheish bo kares. The whole sugya that we learned, it's all based on one premise that if lu yitzur essay would be docholosas, then it would be a mitzvah yibum. Now, how can there be a mitzvah yibum according to everything we've said in the Rishon and the Ramban and so forth and so on? That if there's no ishus, there's no zika, and there can't be yibum. What do you mean? Essay docholosas. How can the Gemara operate with two different systems that seem to be mutually exclusive? One system says, well, if there's no kedushin, there cannot be zika, there cannot be yibum, there cannot be chalitza, according to Rabbanan, cannot be krisis, according to Tosu, according to Rabbi Akiva, Chayvei Lav. That's one system. The other system says, if there's essay docholosaseh, then the essay of yibum will override the losaseh of erva. Oh, well, we have a problem. Why? Because erva is a chayvei krisis, and the essay is not powerful enough to override a lav sheyesh bo kares, but a lav lav bial, a regular classic lav, run-of-the-mill lav. Everybody agrees that essay docholosas. No one would deny that. And the implication is that once we get essay docholosas off the ground, then there will be evil. Nobody got up and objected. What do you mean? How can you apply essay docholosas? She's an erva. There's no tfisas kedushin, and therefore there's no zika. That's what the Gemara should have been yelling and screaming. Don't hack me with essay docholosas. We have here a bit of a technical answer. And I didn't always understand this next piece, but maybe we'll clarify it as we learn it together. He says, Tzorach Lomar, there's a sequential variable here in terms of sequence. What do we know at this point? What do we know at that point? It's Tzorach Lomar. Lois Chadish came. We don't know at this point that if there's no Tfisis Kedushin, therefore there cannot be Zika, there cannot be Yibum. That Chiddush we'll only know later on. Again, I don't know, the language is a little bit bothersome to me because I don't know what he means by Mevureres Bispara. We have a Yalfusa for it that there's no Yibum in an Erva. In fact, the Gemara is going to ask, according to Rebbe, what is that Yalfusa? Or maybe Fakir to Torah's being Matir, you remember Latero Hekes, or whatever it is. But anyway, he calls it Spara. I'm not sure exactly what. But now we derive the conclusion that if there's no Tfisis Kedushin, there's no Yibum, there's no Zik. Umakoro mi im lo yachpotza ish lo lekachta. He doesn't want to marry a chafetz. If he would want to marry her, it's biyam, because she's not an Erev. Umikan dafka mishi yochel liyabim sarach lachlos. We see that the parsha here of chalitza, right, if lo yachpotz, means that he didn't want to implement Yibum, and that makes it a package deal. Chalitza is the negative, the negation of Yibum, when there would have been Yibum. Yibum is alive and well as a possibility. Umikan, dafka bisha yafali yabem sarach lach. And what does this drasha come to exclude? Comes to exclude an erva, so now that we've excluded an erva from yibum, now we know that chalitza, which is an imlo yachpot, is dependent upon whether there's yibum or not yibum. If you derive the conclusion that there is no yibum, b'meila kol shein ol yibum eina ol chalitza, and that's where we're going to formulate our breakthrough svara that it all depends on whether there's zika. That equation that zika is ishus, and if there's no tfisis kedushin, then there cannot be zika. The ena tofesis ba b'mi she'ein lo ba tfisis ishus. Aval ilu mispara isa erva misyabemes. Again, at an early stage in the sugya, when we're dealing with essay dochalos, implying that if essay could override lotus, then there would be a mitzvah yibum, and we're asking, but how could that be? There's no tzitzis kedushin, and therefore there's no zika. So how does essay dochalos help you in any way? The answer is because we don't know yet this breakthrough that Zika is Ishus, Mixas Ishus. Once we know that Zika is Mixas Ishus, we know that if there's no Yibum, there's no Chalitza. Because the reason why an Erev was excluded from Yibum is because there's no Zika. And if there's no Zika for Yibum, then there's no Zika for Chalitza as well. And that's called Sheina Ola, etc. But that's only at the end of the line. We got to the last stop on the train, and we've already formulated and derived this principle that in a case where there's no tfisis kedushin, there's no yibum and there's no chalitza, which means, in conceptual terms, zika equals ishus. There cannot be zika, yibum, and chalitza if there's no ishus, and therefore, hence, in a tfisis kedushin, there's no zika. But we don't know that at this point. At this early stage in the Gemara, we're operating within the framework and only within the framework of Esei Dochalosas. I could certainly argue that in the Havamina, when we were operating with Esei Dochalosas, there is a possibility that Rabbi Akiva would be modeh that in Pitzua Daka there is Yibum. Why? Because we're operating with Esei Dochalosas, and there's no issue of Karetz in the case of Pitzua Daka. So Rabbi Kiva would confess that there's a difference between Chayve Krisus and Chayve Lavin, based on the principles of Esei Dochalosas. But Lemaskana that we exclude Yibum in the case of an Erva, we're going to derive from that if there's no Tfisis Kedushin, then there cannot be Zika, and there cannot be neither Yibum nor Chalitza if there's no Zika. But that whole structure came later. Once we have that structure, then the Gemara is justified in its conclusion that according to Rabbi Akiva, there won't be Yibum nor Chalitza in the case of Chayvei Lav, because Rabbi Akiva maintains that Chayvei Lav ain't but Tfisis Kedushin. And Zika is Mixas Ishus. There's no Ishus in the case of Chayvei Lav. If that be the case, there's no Zika. And if there's no Zika, there's no Yibum, and there's no Chalitza. That's going to justify all those three sugyas that assume that according to Rabbi Akiva, there's no Yibum or Chalitza in the case of Chayvei Lav. Now we have an interesting chiddush of Rabbi Shimon Shkar. With Shuvas HaRashba, when the Rashba apparently was asked this question about how the Gemara was so convinced that according to Rabbi Akiva, there's no Yibum, there's no Chalitza in the case of Chayvei Lav. Kosav liyashiv b'derech acheretz al pi hamavur b'Yushalmi. What did Yushalmi say? That Rabbi Akiva yalfin and Chayvei Lavim me'achos isha. Sha'af hein p'turas michalitza v'yibum t'motza. Now, according to Yushalmi, we have Rabbi Akiva head on, explicit, telling us there's no Yibum, there's no Chalitza in Chayvei Lav, and we're going to derive from Achos Isha. Ayin Sham, go look at the Yushalmi and figure out exactly how we derive from Achos Isha Chayvei Lav, according to Rabbi Akiva. Beer of Shimon Avodas Had. Shehine is barely el barichus, she'af she'erva ena tzricha kra. Ena tzricha kra means that we can derive from svara. Ela ena misyaves svara. Bishum she'en esei dochalosa sheish bokaris. That's going to be the final maskana. And if we talk about Shabbos, for example, we're going to talk about Machamer and not Bishul. You remember all that. The Achar Shenemar P'tur B'Tzara. Now, wait a second. I understand that you could argue Ein Esei Dochalosas vis-a-vis Rivka. She's the Erva. But what about Hatzara? What about the other wife that he has? Let's say he's married also to Rachel. What does that have to do with Esei Dochalosas? Behechre, the Midrashas Halel, which I'm assuming now he means for Tsaras Erva, his Chadesh, the Erva, Tur, the Indian Din Yibuma, I think should be a map. Milvad Mashi Asura Lisyaben, Bisvar. Bisvar meaning if we cannot apply the principle of Esei Dochalosas, we cannot override the Losas of Erva. But now we have Oleh. Oleh cannot be teaching me some sort of limitation in Esei Dochalosas, which we know from Sfara. So what is Oleh teaching me? That is a new P'tur. It's very interesting. On the one hand, the Yushalmi holds there's no Havamina that you would have a mitzvah Yibum in a case of an Erva. But on the other hand, the Torah went out of its way to teach me a Din P'tur. Why is that necessary? Right? Milvad mimashi yasura l'syavi b'svara. On top of that is chadish be'erva p'tur, which we derive from alel, inyan yibuma. Oh, izeh yesh b'shem erva halba p'tur miyibum. Af im yitzur shalo yeba kares. Interesting. We were operating within the framework of Esei Dochalosas. We came to the conclusion that ain't Esei Dochalosa because of kares. But therefore, the implication would be that if it wasn't kares and it was just a lav, then we would apply the principle of Esei Dochalosas, which is exactly the kasha that the Rishonim were asking. But the answer is that in addition to the spara that we suspend Esei Dochalosa, so we also have a special Yalfusa of a Leah to teach me a Ptur Midin Yibu in a case of an error. Af she'ein ba kares. Now we don't no longer need that variable of kares, which is only relevant if I had one limud, which is a Svaradic limud, that there's no essay. The essay is not endowed with the power to override a losa shishbo kares. But now on top of that, I derive from Litzrar, from a Leah, that there's a separate din ptur in Yibum. And what is that ptur coming from? What does it emanate from? The Shem Erva. Well, if that be the case, then Hevina Gemara b'Tasar v'Akiva she'af hu modeh sherak barayos ein tosin kiddushin v'avlad mamzeh. There's a word missing here. Ein kiddushin tosin. Because again, we're no longer operating within the limitations of Esei Dochalosa, so we have now a limud to exclude an erva, and any woman, even if she only has a lav, is considered an erva according to Rabbi Akiva. V'alkein af hein b'chlal p'tur erva miyivma nilma me'aleh u'memela af p'turos min ha'chalitza mishum shekol she'ein ol yivma ein ol chalitza she'nemar klal zeh b'chol mishal atofsim b'kiddush. Beautiful. So this, according to Rav Shimon Shkop, is the deeper meaning of the Yerushalmi. And the Yerushalmi is offering us a whole nother answer to the question, how do we know that Rabbi Akiva and Chayvei Lav would exclude Yibum and Chalitza? And the answer is because, according to Yerushalmi, we have two different levels. In Hebrew, we'd say Shnei Revidim, one Ravid and another Ravid, right? So on the first level, we're operating within the framework of Esei Dochalosas. And we're going to say, well, Losas Sheish Bekaris, and therefore there's no Yibum in an Erev. But that only applies to Chayvei Krisus. Now we're going to introduce Chayvei Lavim, and we're back to square one, and we'll activate Esei Dochalosas. Hence, there should be Yibum in the case of Chayvei Lavim, even according to Rabbi Akiva. But on top of the, or independent of the issue of Esei Dochalosas, so we also have Yalfusa from a Leah. And what is the lab teaching me? I knew it misvara, so I excluded Yibum in the case of an Arab anyway. Or it's teaching me something very, very important that has nothing to do with Esei Dochalosis. And even if you were to have an Esei Dochalosis, an erva is excluded from Yibum by virtue of a limud derived from a lel. And the nafkamina is now going to be a case of Chayvei Lavin, which according to Rabbi Akiva, although essay would be Dochalosis in that case, but nevertheless there won't be Yibum because the Torah was a poter. There's a special pur that we derive from Olel to exclude Yibum in the case of an Erev. And who is an Erev? Well, I got news for you. A big chiddush splashing on the front cover of the newspaper. And that is that according to Rabbi Akiva, Chayvei Lavim is an erva. There's no Tvisis Kedushin, and a lot is a mamzer. And now we have this new p'tur of Alea, according to Yerushalmi, that's teaching me that whenever there's an erva, there's no Yibum and there's no Chalitza, even though we would have applied the principle of Esei. So that's where we'll stop for today. So Mirza Shem. And tomorrow we'll be ready for Daf 9. Okay then? I'll take this opportunity to wish you a great day.